10 to 40. The text for today's sermon, it's in the bulletin, and it's in the bulletin every week. Sometimes I struggle with whether we should have the text in the bulletin or not, just because I wonder if I'm not helping you to be a good reader of the Bible. And if you are a Christian, I encourage you to bring your own Bible, but finding passages in the Bible, knowing where certain books of the Bible are, it's good. I think it's important, and it helps us to be good readers of the Bible. Today, I've made a few changes to the text. I preach from the ESV, the English Standard Version. Now, in the English, there are lots of different versions of the Bible. There's the NIV, there's the King James Version, there's the New Living Translation, and there's many, many more. But I preach from the English Standard Version. The English Standard Version, it's a very literal translation of the Bible. So in the original Bible, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is written in Greek. And if you speak various languages, if you speak more than one language, you know that one word can be translated differently depending on the word or the context. And that's why there are different translations of the Bible. There are some differences of translation. The NIV, it's more of a common, the common language of the day. The NLT, the New Living Translation, it's a very easy translation to read. Again, the ESV Bible is very literal. It's a very literal translation, so it's kind of dry. It's not really exciting to read, but it's a very good study version of the Bible. Now, there's a couple of changes that I've made, and I do it really carefully. I don't think that I'm smarter than a lot of scholars, but I think it's important that we know what the Bible says. And so let me give you an example. In verse 10, I'll just start. I'm just going to read verse 10, and then I'll go back. But the Apostle Paul says to the married, the wife should not separate her husband. And that's what the ESV says. The wife should not separate from her husband. And it also says the husband should not divorce his wife. So the NIV actually doesn't translate it that way. The NIV says the wife must not separate from her husband, and the husband must not divorce his wife. So there's a lot more emphasis, right? There's a big difference between you should not divorce and you must not divorce. And then there's other translations that will say, let the wife not separate from her husband, and let the husband not divorce his wife. And so, again, this issue of marriage and divorce, it's a really big topic in the world that we live in, and especially in the country that we live in. And given that, I think it's important that we understand exactly what God is saying about divorce. Is it should? Is it must? What is it saying? So I'm just going to tell you, very literally, it says this: the wife not separate her husband. Very literally in the Greek, that's what it says. The wife not separate her husband. I think the best translation, and so that I put it in brackets. And so if I ever put something in brackets, it means, this is what I think is the best translation. So I put, the wife is not to separate from her husband. The husband is not to divorce his wife. And there's one other change that I've made in verse 29, and there are other places. Sometimes the Apostle Paul will use brothers adelphos. And it actually it's not just meant for men, it's actually, it's meant for men and women. And so I translate that brothers and sisters, right? And so I think he's addressing not just men, but he's addressing the entire church. And so I just put brothers and sisters there. So just so that you understand the passage that is in the bulletin, it is from the ESV, but I've made a few changes there. In 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul is addressing topics that the Corinthians have written to him about. So they have questions. They've had questions about sex. Is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? What about a husband and a wife? And that's what we looked at last week. This week, we're really looking at marriage. And I'll say this. There are good things happening in the Corinthian church. It seems like people are being converted. People are being brought to faith in Jesus Christ. But along with that conversion, there are some new problems that are arising. And one of the problems seem to be in marriage. And so the Apostle Paul takes this opportunity to address and to answer the question that they write to them about marriage. So we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 to 40. This is the Word of God. To the married, and this is married believers. Both the men and the women are Christian. Okay? So to the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. This comes straight from Jesus. The wife is not to separate from her husband. But if she does, she is to remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife. To the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. Now, what the Apostle Paul means there is Jesus didn't address this next topic specifically. But given the entirety of Jesus' teaching, this is how the Apostle Paul interprets Jesus' teaching, and this is how he believes Jesus would have us to address this next topic. So to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he is not to divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she is not to divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers and sisters, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress It is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Well, first of all, let me start by saying that this passage does not cover the topic of marriage and divorce in its entirety. It covers a particular aspect of marriage and a particular aspect of divorce. If there are other questions that you have about marriage and divorce that this passage does not address, please come and talk to me. I do not intend to address the entirety of this topic. This is a big topic, and it's a very, I guess, complicated topic. So let me start by saying that. When I was in college, my second year of college, I went on a mission trip. I went on a mission trip to Malaysia and Thailand, and so I actually took a year off of school, and it was a 6-month mission trip. It was with a missions organization called Youth with a Mission, and I did something called the Discipleship Training School. And my mom convinced me by saying, hey, how would you like to go to Hawaii for 6 months and not go to school? I'm like, yeah, that sounds great to me. And so I did 3 months of training, like Bible study in Hawaii, and then for the next 3 months I was in Thailand and Malaysia. We visited a church in Malaysia on a particular Sunday, and Malaysia is a Muslim country. And there are 3 people groups in Malaysia. They're the Malays, they're the Chinese, and they're the Indians. And you can evangelize to the Chinese and to the Indians, but it is illegal to evangelize to the Malaysians, to the Malays. So I went to this church, and it was a small church. They met at the pastor's house. And so, we weren't expecting that many people. But all of a sudden, about 10 to 15 people came all together. There was one man, and there were 2 women, and there were lots of kids. And it just didn't look very right. It was like, what's going on? Like, there's one man, and he has 2 women. Like, he has 2 wives. And the children, and I think there were about 10 children altogether, they were his children from the two wives. So at first, I was in my 20s. I was like, what is going on here? What kind of church is this? How can a man have two wives? And the pastor explained to us that he was a Muslim. And as a Muslim, he had two wives. But then he came to faith in Jesus Christ. He came to faith in Jesus Christ while he had two wives and many children from his two wives. So if you were his pastor, if you were the pastor of this family, what would you say to him? Right? Like, okay, you need to choose one wife and one set of kids and, abandon the other. What are you supposed to say? And so the pastor, and I think in his wisdom, and I think this is wisdom from God, in his wisdom he said, no more wives. You know what? I guess a tangent. I don't know why anyone would want two wives anyways. Because if you're married, having one wife is difficult. It's hard enough, to have one wife. I don't know why anybody would want two wives. It's incredibly difficult. And I've met, Dr. Dan. Dr. Dan, he's a missionary in Mali. And Mali is a Muslim country. And so I've learned about his neighbors. And, his neighbors have multiple wives. And, the man has to treat all of his wives the same. It just seems incredibly difficult. And so just a tangent. I don't know why anybody would want two wives or two husbands. It's difficult enough, having one. And it's great just having one. But anyways, going back to my story. And so the pastor said, no more wives. No more wives. You're to love, your wives and your children, but no more. And so that's the instruction that he gave to this family. And so this was the largest family at this church. And so it shows, I think it's similar to what's going on here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Conversion is a great thing. It's great when people are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. But it does cause unique issues or unique problems. Paul here is not saying, and he's not advocating for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. Okay, that's not what's going on here. Paul is not saying it's okay or even that you should, if you're a Christian, marry a non-Christian. And where he makes it absolutely clear is in verse 39. In verse 39, he says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Okay? So there's only one restriction. You are free to marry whoever you want, but the one restriction is, but in the Lord. So if you are a Christian, right, the only requirement or only restriction that you have is you have to marry another Christian. So even at the next youth conference, the guest speaker said, there's no such thing as missionary dating, right? You can't date a non-Christian, thinking, okay, I'm going to bring them to faith in Christ. I will say this. I was talking to some of the students at the next youth conference, and they were asking, why can't you date a non-Christian? Why can't you date a non-Christian? And I'm sure most, if not all of you in this room can understand where they're coming from. There's a great temptation when it comes to dating. And especially when, there are some non-Christians that seem very attractive, in different ways. And you're attracted to them, And so some students were asking, why can't I date a non-Christian? Or why can't you marry a non-Christian? Well, the first thing that I'll say is dating is intended for marriage. And so I think a good principle of dating is, if you're not preparing for marriage, if you're not ready for marriage, I don't know if you're ready for dating, right? Dating is intended for marriage. And so, and you shouldn't want to marry. I would say this, I don't think, if you're a Christian, I understand the temptation. Okay, I understand the temptation, but deep down, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't want to date and or marry a non-Christian. You just shouldn't. Because you can't share. If you're a Christian, that means that your faith in Jesus Christ is the most important thing to you. But if you date a non-Christian or marry a non-Christian, the most important thing about your life, you cannot share with that other individual. That other individual, that person you're dating or you're married to, they can't understand the most important part about you. And I would find that incredibly frustrating. Now, I don't know if you who are married would agree with me, but my greatest desire in marriage is to be understood. It really is. I want my wife to understand me. And the most frustrating times in marriage is when I feel like my wife doesn't get me, when my wife doesn't understand me. And I think when you fight, that's why you raise your voice, because you feel like you're not being heard, right? You feel like you're not being understood. And so you feel like, okay, well, if I talk a little louder, then maybe she'll understand where I'm coming from. There's a great desire to be understood. There's a great desire to be known in marriage. And if you date or marry a non-Christian, they'll never fully understand you. They'll never fully know you. You know, one of the things I recently realized as people is that all people want to be known and we want to know. That's what a relationship is, right? We're relational. God has made us relational creatures. Well, what does it mean to be relational? It means that we want to be known. We want other people to know us, but we also want to know other people. I think that's the genius of story. The reason people love stories is because you can identify with that person through their story, right? Or you can even understand yourself in and through stories. That's why you love it when people tell you stories. If I'm good at anything when it comes to talking, I think I'm good at telling stories. I think that might, and I think that's important because that's how we make ourselves known, and that's how we get to know other people. And that's how God makes himself known. The genius of the Bible is that God reveals himself in story, right? And we can really connect with stories, right? To be known and to know. But I'll say this right now. If you date and marry a non-Christian, you won't have that. You won't have that. That person who's a non-Christian, they will not understand the most important part of your life. So my question to you, if you're a Christian, why would you want to date and marry a non-Christian? Why? Why would you want to date someone who will never fully get you, who will never fully understand you? Why would you want that? And I'll say something, and it's kind of blunt, but I will say it. But if you're okay with dating and or marrying a non-Christian, you may want to ask yourself how important Jesus really is to you. Because the only way that you can date or marry a non-Christian is by putting Jesus away. You have to hide Jesus. You have to put him away. Another way I'll say it is just really bluntly, if you can date and or marry a non-Christian, you may want to ask yourself whether you really are a Christian or not. And I know it's blunt, but I think it's true. Because if Jesus is that important to you, if your life is found in Jesus, then how can you date and marry somebody who doesn't get that, who doesn't know that? So Paul here is not advocating and he's not encouraging that a Christian would date or marry a non-Christian. What he is saying is this. This passage is broken into 4 parts. He starts with the married in verse 10, right? The married Christian couple. Both the man and the woman, the husband and wife, they're both Christian. From verse 12 to verse 16 has to do with a married couple in which one is a Christian and one is not. And then he goes on in verse 17. In verse 17 and 24, he talks about circumcision, uncircumcision. He talks about bondservant and free. And I don't know if you get while he's saying this, but this is the key. Verse 20 and verse 24, the Apostle Paul says the same thing. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. So brothers and sisters, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain there with God. So this is the big thing with the Apostle Paul. He wants you to put your confidence in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. What makes you a Christian is your faith in Jesus Christ. It's not anything that you've done. It's not your circumcision. It's not your uncircumcision. It's not your standing in the world. And it doesn't even have to do with who you're married to. See, this whole passage, it's about marriage. And so this passage in verses 17 to 24, when he talks about circumcision, uncircumcision, bondservant, and free, it all has to do with the condition in which you were called. When you were called by God as a Christian, if you were married to a non-Christian, let's say when you were married, both the husband and the wife were non-Christian. You both were not believers. But what happens when one or the other becomes a Christian? That was the condition in which you were called. You were called to faith in Jesus Christ while you were married to a non-believer. And if that's the condition in which you were called, you are to remain in that condition. That's what he's talking about, right? You understand? This whole context, it's about marriage, right? Being married to a non-Christian doesn't somehow make you less of a Christian, right? It doesn't make you a non-Christian if you were married both as non-Christians. If you were both not Christian when you got married, but one or the other became Christian, the condition in which you were called as a follower of Jesus Christ is being married to a non-believer. You are to stay in that condition. Okay? That's what he's talking about. And then verses 25 to 38, Paul goes on this long talk about being betrothed, single and engaged. I'm not going to go over it. But especially for those of you who are married, you will nod your head to this. It's true. There are definite advantages to being married, but there are also advantages to being single, right? And it is true that there is more anxiety if you're married. I don't regret being married, but I wouldn't mind eating ramen and Spam every day. I could do it. But I'm married, right? And I have kids. And my wife isn't going to be okay with eating ramen. And I have not eaten Spam in 14 years. My wife will not buy it. And I try to convince her, what if something really bad happens? We should have some on the shelf, right? And there was one time we almost bought some, but we've never bought it. If I come to your house to eat, you can cook me Spam, right? My kids have never tasted Spam. They have no idea what it tastes like, right? But, if you're married, you can't do what you want. You can't sleep on the floor all the time. Like, you can't just eat ramen and Spam all the time. Like, you have more anxiety, right? You have to worry about other people, right? It's a good thing to be married. But the truth is, if you're married, there's going to be more problems. There's just going to be more things to worry about. And the Apostle Paul is not saying that's good or bad. He's just saying that's the fact of being married. And he's saying there are advantages and disadvantages to being married and to being single. And he's saying you're being single, there's a great advantage to it. You can be wholly devoted to the Lord, right? And that's all he's saying. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on that passage if you want to go over it in depth. But I think that what he says is absolutely true. And then in verse 39, he talks about the wife being bound to her husband. But if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. So let me say this. The Apostle Paul addresses the topic of marriage and divorce. And divorce is a huge topic. We all know that more than 50% of marriages in America end in divorce. And that is not all too different in the church. The statistics about divorce are actually very similar outside of the church and inside of the church. It's a big topic. And it's something that, that we need to understand well. Along with the topic of divorce is also remarriage. Is it okay? Does God allow remarriage? So let me first say this. In this passage, the Apostle Paul is talking to the person who wants to initiate the divorce. Okay? He is talking to the person who wants to initiate the divorce. He is not talking to the person who has had divorce forced upon them. Okay? He is talking to the person who wants to initiate the divorce, and in every case he says, the wife is not to separate from her husband, the husband is not to divorce his wife. And what's interesting in this passage is the Apostle Paul seems to be speaking to wives a lot. He talks to wives. The wife is not to separate from her husband. And I wonder if it's because there are a lot of women who are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. I just wonder if there are a lot of women in Corinth who are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. And therefore, it's a lot of the women who are struggling with this issue. But every time he says, the wife is not to separate from her husband, the husband is not to divorce his wife. And even if you're married to an unbeliever, let's say you came to faith in Jesus Christ, later while you were married to an unbeliever, he says, even in that case, if the unbelieving spouse agrees and consents to live with you, then you are not to divorce. You are not to divorce. There's only one but, and the but happens in verse 15. And this is if you don't initiate it, but if it happens to you. If divorce happens to you, you don't initiate it, it's forced upon you against your will. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. It's not enslaved. God has called you to peace. In that case, the Apostle Paul and God allows for divorce. Let me say this. There are a lot of other passages in the Bible that talk about divorce. Somebody asked me, is it ever God's will for a married couple to get a divorce? Is it ever God's will for a married couple to get a divorce? My answer would be no. It's never God's will. But then I'll say there are some exceptions, though. And there are some exceptions. And there are very few, I think. I think there are very few, but I think there are some exceptions. And I don't like hypotheticals. I don't like hypotheticals because you can make anything up. You can make almost any situation, anything is possible. And so if you feel like that you're in that exception, please come and talk to me. But I will say, I think the exceptions are very few. But I do think there are some cases, because of sin, that God allows for divorce. John Piper, he's a well-known pastor. He calls it the two wills of God. There is God's ultimate will, and there is God's secondary will. And your secondary will is your will because of sin. So I'll tell you this. God's ultimate will is that no married couple ever gets a divorce. That's God's ultimate will for marriage. But I think there are some very few exceptions where God will allow it to happen. He allows it because of sin. Let me give you an example of my own life. I have a son. His name is Caleb. My ultimate will is that he would always have the use of both arms and both legs. I'm his father. You all know that he loves sports, right? And so my ultimate will, is that my son would always have full use of both arms and both legs. But what if my son had a disease? What if my son had something like flesh-eating bacteria? And if we didn't do something, that he would die. And what if the doctor said, we're going to have to amputate, or we're going to have to remove one limb? Because if we don't, he's going to die. What's my will? See, at the same time, I have two competing wills. I still have an ultimate will. My ultimate will is that my son would always have full use of two arms and two legs. But because of this disease, I have a secondary will. It hasn't changed my ultimate will. But because of this sickness, I have a secondary will. And I would allow the doctor to do it. because of sickness. I wouldn't do it happily, right? But I would allow it to happen. I think it's similar when it comes to divorce. God's ultimate will for for marriage, is that no one would ever get a divorce. But because of sin, God has made an exception. God allows, in some cases, for married couples to get a divorce. Now I'll say this. Nobody should ever be happy about getting a divorce. If you're ever happy about getting a divorce, you just don't get it. It should always break your heart. No matter, even if it's good. There are some cases where I think it's good for a married couple to get a divorce because of sin. Right? But I don't think anyone should ever be happy because of it. It's always heartbreaking. Whenever a marriage ends in divorce, it's always heartbreaking. And I will tell you, it always breaks the heart of God. Always. Even if it's good for that couple to get a divorce. It always breaks the heart of God. But because of sin, abuse, I think there are exceptions. I think there are times when God allows divorce to happen. Now, let me just say this, and this is not what's addressed here, but let me say this. A lot of people know that it's wrong to commit adultery. And so what they'll do is try to get around that. That rule is they'll get a divorce, and they'll marry another person, and they'll say, well, I didn't commit adultery. And that's why the Apostle Paul says, if you divorce, you should either remain unmarried or be reconciled to your husband or wife. The goal of divorce should never be remarriage. If your goal of divorce is to get remarried, that's not allowed. That's adultery. See, some people think that you can kind of get around the rule of adultery and say, okay, well, if I just divorce this person, then I'm free and I can marry whoever I want again. And that's where God teaches in the Bible, that's wrong. Again, the Bible is talking to individuals who initiate divorce. And if you are initiating a divorce because thinking that you can get married again, you are wrong. That is not God's will for you, and that is not God's will for divorce. However, I am not saying, and I do not think the Bible teaches, that you cannot get remarried. Again, if divorce was forced upon you, if it was not your choice, but the choice of your spouse. Just like in verse 15, if your unbelieving partner separates from you, it says, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. Then if her husband dies in verse 39, she is free to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. I don't think the Bible says you can't get remarried. I'm just saying that the Bible teaches that that should not be your goal for divorce. If you divorce, having in your mind, I'm going to divorce so that I can get remarried, that is not God's will. And in such cases, the Apostle Paul says, you should remain single or you should be reconciled to your husband and wife. So, again, I know that I'm oversimplifying it. And even as I started, I know that I'm not addressing every issue about marriage and or divorce. But I do think that the majority of marriages and divorces fall under this category. I really do. That God's will for marriage is the wife not to separate from her husband, and the husband is not to divorce his wife. Even if you come to faith in Jesus Christ later and your spouse is a non-believer, if your unbelieving spouse consents, agrees to live with you, you are not to divorce him or her. marriage is so important because marriage is the best picture of what God wants with the church. I mean, marriage is the best example. It's the best picture of the relationship that God has with us as people. God's love is strong. God's love is steadfast. I'll end by telling you a story. I read this from a book. It's a true story about a man. His wife had a gambling problem, and she was stealing from him, and it caused their family to go bankrupt. And a lot of people said, "Why are you staying with her? Why don't you just divorce her? I mean, she's ruining your life." And he answered by saying, "How is my wife ever going to know that she has a husband in God who will love her despite whatever she does, her sin, if I cannot forgive her?" And then he says of his own children, "How can I tell my children that they have a Father in heaven who loves them and forgives them of their sin if I can't love and forgive their mother?" And I think this man, he understood it. He understood why marriage was so important. Because marriage, it exemplifies the love that God has for his people. That God's love, I love the words, God's love is steadfast. God's love is faithful. God's love is strong. God's love is patient. Right? And because God loves us that way, that's how we're called to love one another. And I said this, and I'll end by saying this. I do think that possibly the church's greatest witness in the world may be its marriages. How can we show the world that God exists? How can we show the world who God is? I think our greatest witness may be our husbands and our fathers, but similarly, I think our greatest witness to the world may be in our marriages. And that's why it's so absolutely critical that we do it well. Because this doesn't just have temporary implications, but marriage has eternal implications. Would you pray with me as we close today? Father in heaven,